This past June 2023, the U.S. federal debt ceiling was raised yet again. The current debt limit is $32.68 trillion. If you think that's bad, well, even worse is the fact that the previous ceiling was raised just 2 years prior, back in December 2021, when the debt ceiling was increased to $31.4 trillion. Today, we're looking at what the debt ceiling is and what will happen if the U.S. defaults. We'll also see the huge impact the car industry has on the U.S. economy. This part may surprise you. By the way, a lot of time and research was done to put together this video, and I really want to know what you think. So, while you're watching it, please comment below and share your thoughts. The term debt ceiling refers to the maximum amount of money the United States can borrow by issuing bonds. Other terms you might have heard for the debt ceiling are debt limit or statutory debt limit. The debt ceiling was created all the way back in 1917. That was under the Second Liberty Bond Act. Before 1917, Congress pretty much had free reign over the country's finances. Then entered the year 1917. World War I was in full swing and a debt ceiling got created. Why? Well, put simply, the purpose was to make the federal government more fiscally responsible. Now, here's the thing about the debt limit. It hasn't been the same since 1917. Over the years, it's been raised whenever the U.S. approached the limit. This is because if the U.S. were to hit the limit and not be able to pay interest limits to bondholders, the U.S. would be in default. This would then lower its credit rating and increase the cost of the debt. Here's another thing about the debt ceiling. It's been super controversial, and it's a hot and sticky topic in more ways than one. For example, some say the debt ceiling just isn't constitutional at all. If you were to read the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, you'd read that the validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law shall not be questioned. Critics say that by having a debt ceiling in place and having to raise it puts pressure on U.S. and questions the U.S. ability to pay its bills. But let's put things in perspective. Not many people know this, but if you were to look at the most democratic countries in the world today, you'll find they all have one thing in common. They don't have a debt ceiling. It's the opposite of what we have in the States. America is yet again an exception to the rule. If I asked you to guess how many times the federal debt ceiling has been raised, extended, or revised since 1960, what would you say? Maybe 10, 20, or 30 times? Believe it or not, the answer is actually 78 times. I'm not joking. I'm talking a span of just 63 years. That's more times than the years that have passed. The next obvious question is, why has this happened so many times? I'll give you the short answer. The purpose has been to avoid the worst case scenario. The worst case being if the U.S. were to default on its debt. If you want to wrap your head around this, just imagine for a second that the U.S. did default. What would that mean and what would that cause? Well, for starters, it'd send shockwaves to the global financial markets. Financial analysts say we'd see stock prices fall by about a third. It would also cut around 4% from the U.S. GDP. As a result, companies would need to lay off people. The estimate is at least 6 million American jobs lost. Think of that for a minute here. 6 million Americans without a job. In a nutshell, it would lead even to another great recession. So, you can see the terrible repercussions you can follow if the U.S. were ever to default. But don't just take my word for it. Just rewind more than 10 years ago back to 2011. The government got dangerously close to reaching the debt ceiling. Fortunately, then President Obama and House Republicans were able to avoid reaching the limit. Nevertheless, that year we saw stock prices plummeting, volatility spiking, and the U.S. credit rating got downgraded for the first time ever. And that gave America a good glimpse of what can happen if the U.S. were to default. But a government default would create much larger ramifications beyond creating economic uncertainty. A U.S. default would also make it very difficult for the government to carry out crucial functions that we need day to day. I'm talking about basic things like issuing Social Security benefits, distributing enough funds to the public health system, and maintaining national defense, just to name a few. All of these programs would suffer because the Treasury won't be able to issue any more bonds, which means the government wouldn't receive any more debt revenue. Sure, tax revenue would continue to come in, but it wouldn't be enough to cover our debt. So now you can understand what U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen meant when she said the government's failure to meet its obligations would cause, in quotes, irreparable harm to the U.S. economy, the livelihoods of all Americans, and global financial stability. But let's go back to the controversial question about whether a debt ceiling is a good idea or not. Well, the answer really depends on who you ask. First of all, some believe that having a debt ceiling keeps the nation's finances in check. That means the U.S. Treasury can easily issue bonds and doesn't have to sit around and wait for Congress's approval each and every time the federal government needs to raise money. A debt ceiling sets the boundaries that help make the monetary approval process more efficient. A debt ceiling also provides the means to continue funding government important social programs. Think of things like Medicare and Social Security. Finally, by raising the debt ceiling, it gives the U.S. a little more breathing space and wiggle room to keep funding federal operations. Put simply, it helps to keep the government running. But the federal debt ceiling has its fair share of critics. First of all, in case you couldn't already tell, the debt ceiling is notorious for getting raised, and very easily too. So much so that it's even caused people to start questioning whether or not it's really an effective tool to ensure fiscal responsibility. Let's be real. The debt ceiling was supposed to help this country's debt, not support it as it reaches record high levels. And it's not just American critics I'm talking about here. There are lots of other critics from abroad. In fact, the debt ceiling has negatively affected the U.S.'s reputation in global markets. Believe it or not, America has seen a few debt ceiling showdowns over the years, and these showdowns have led to government shutdowns. For example, back in 1995, Republican members of Congress threatened not to raise the debt ceiling to negotiate increased government spending. Then President Bill Clinton refused to make the cuts, and as a result, the government shut down twice until an agreement was reached. Years later, the aptly called 2011 debt ceiling crisis, Republicans in Congress demanded deficit reductions as part of increasing the debt ceiling. While this was going on, the U.S. Treasury debt was stripped of its high AAA rating. Up until that year, it had held that rating for 70 years. Just 2 years later, in 2013, the government shut down for 16 days after conservative Republicans attempted to defund the Affordable Care Act by leveraging the debt ceiling. An agreement to suspend the debt was passed within a day, which just so happened to be when the U.S. Treasury was estimated to run out of money. Anyway, you're probably wondering why stuff like this keeps happening and why the U.S. is always coming so close to hitting the national debt ceiling. Well, in fact, the U.S. is spending a lot, and therefore it keeps taking on more debt. It's as simple as that. In a way, you can liken it to your family budget. You only have so much money. The prudent thing to do is to set up a yearly family budget. Try to stick to it. Problem is, anything can go wrong. Maybe you miscalculated your expenses. Or let's say a sudden unexpected need comes up. Or let's say a new trendy product, which you don't need, goes on sale. Any of these three scenarios can lead you to spend more money than you have. Well, the government's like a huge family, really, if you think about it. Tribe of tribes, if you will. Think about wars and conflicts, which are really expensive. Or think about the investments that are needed during recessions. Consider, too, the cost of relief aid during national disasters or even the pandemic. Even social programs domestically add to our spendings. So you can see how the national debt can skyrocket quickly. The department that's in charge of all this is the U.S. Treasury. It collects tax revenue and it spends money to fund the government. Now, technically, it's Congress and the president who decide how much taxes should be, where the money should be spent. But when it comes to the handling of the flow of money, that's left to the Treasury's hand. The Treasury essentially approves more spending than it receives in with taxes. So how does it make up for the deficit? Pretty much it takes on debt, and it does this by taking on bonds. Not many people know this, but more than 1/3 of these bonds are owned by American citizens and American companies. And the largest part of this debt is owned by the federal government itself. That's right. The federal government technically owns part of the federal government's debt. It's a mind-boggling cycle, if you ask me. Anyway, the cycle repeats itself year after year. That's not to say that accumulating all this debt is the end of the entire world and humanity. But that doesn't mean it's good either. It all comes down to what the government decides to do with the debt. In an emergency situation like a pandemic, borrowing money is necessary. But borrowing money and accumulating debt while your country's doing well and has a strong economy, well, that is not a smart move. If you want a quick pulse of the U.S. economy, one simple exercise is to look at the car industry. Here's the thing. The U.S. car industry is a key contributor to the economy. It drives more than $1 trillion into the economy and contributes to $220 billion annually in federal, state, and local tax revenues. In fact, car production is the largest piece of the manufacturing sector here left in the States, and it generates the most number of manufacturing jobs. I'm talking some 2.5 million American jobs here. Globally, the U.S. is the second largest car market in the world, with almost 26 million vehicles sold annually. So you can see why looking at the U.S. car industry gives us a general indication of jobs and overall economic growth. Get this, almost 2 out of every 3 employees in the car industry is employed by Ford, General Motors, and FCA US. Back in 2018, those 3 car makers produced 5.8 million vehicles in America. But that's not all. One study found that across 18 states, cars generate 15 to 23% of state tax revenues. But mind you, the car industry supply chain goes beyond just manufacturing. Apparently, over 8 million Americans are employed either directly or indirectly thanks to the manufacturing, sales, and repairs of automobiles. These 8 million Americans together earn $500 billion in compensation. So you can see the impact of the car industry has on the U.S. economy. Speaking of car sales, many car makers have been selling less units, but at higher prices. Of course, part of it has been due to the limited supply and inventory, but actually, there's also some strategy to selling less volume because you end up making more money per car sold. The problem is that when Jeep starts selling a mid-sized family SUV for $70,000, for example, all of a sudden mid-tier consumers are no longer able to afford these type of cars anymore. And the folks who are left out on the curb and disadvantaged are people with less income. But now you tell me, how do you feel about the U.S. debt ceiling? Do you think that the U.S. will ever default in the years to come? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.